Hello viewers, and welcome to yet another special video production from the 10th Nazgul. My name is Mitch, and joining me as always is Matthew.
Hello everyone.
Today, it looks like we're already back with another late-breaking news article. Fantasy Flight Games tonight announced the second of their Lord of the Rings trilogy Saga Expansions, The Road Darkens. So picking up exactly where the Black Riders left off, in The Road Darkens we're going to be playing through 3 new scenarios that complete the second half of the Fellowship of the Rings novel. We're going to be getting 3 complete new scenarios, only 2 new heroes, one of which is a brand new version of Frodo Baggins of the Fellowship Sphere, as well as several powerful and unique allies. We're going to be seeing 8 new boons, 7 new burdens, and 3 optional campaign cards that guide us through the 4th, 5th, and 6th chapters of the Lord of the Rings saga. The article informs us that we'll be receiving gifts and guidance from the Council of Elrond prior to heading south, where we'll need to escape the wargs that hunt us through the snows of Hollin, and finally navigate our way through the mines of Moria. If we succeed, we might just find brief respite among the elves of Lorien before ultimately setting forth once more and continuing our adventure further east into the lands of shadow. Throughout these scenarios, we'll be forced to grapple with sacrifices, betrayals, and dwindling supplies. We'll be up against a host of daunting new encounter cards, but we'll also have a wealth of powerful new player cards to draw from. Between this article and the Road Darkens Minisite, there are a host of spoilers, whether they're single cards or card fans. So Matthew, why don't you introduce us to one of our 2 new heroes?
So, as you mentioned, we get a new version of Frodo Baggins, belonging to the Fellowship Sphere. He will serve as the 4th hero in your game. He has 0 threat cost, of course, 2 willpower, 1 attack strength, 2 defense strength, and 2 hit points. He has the Hobbit and Ring Bearer traits, and his response reads, after Frodo Baggins exhausts to defend and attack, exhaust the 1 ring and spend 1 Fellowship resource to target the attacking enemy. That enemy cannot deal damage this attack, then raise each player's threat by 2. So, definitely a different ability than the previous version of Frodo, who canceled the effects of an encounter card. Here, Frodo is basically canceling the effects of an attack. So certainly interesting. Each player having to raise their threat by 2 is very reminiscent of the Doomed keyword that we'll be seeing on player cards in the voice of Isengard. So definitely interesting. I'm not so sure how often I'd want to use that, and I think I would probably prefer the previous version of Frodo, but we'll have to see how it works in practice.
Yeah, this is definitely quite a bit different. It's certainly much more combat specific, so instead of just replacing an encounter card outright, you're just mitigating the effects of 1 attack. That threat gain seems fairly inconsequential, reminiscent of the spirit version of Frodo Baggins that we saw back in Conflict at the Carrack. That cost of 2 threats seems like a bargain compared to absorbing an attack from a troll or some other large enemy that we've seen in the past, but I suppose a lot remains to be said based on just how valuable these Fellowship resources are. In the Black Riders, we saw 1 Fellowship Sphere card that was extraordinarily powerful, and this article goes on to reveal a 2nd Fellowship Sphere card that can be incredibly powerful, so we'll have to see just how many spare resources Frodo Baggins may have, how often you'll find yourself swarmed with enemies, or having 1 large enemy where you just really need to mitigate 1 huge attack, or just deal with a multitude of attacks coming your direction. But without knowing much else about Frodo, it's kinda hard to get excited about this ability. It's certainly nice that his ability serves to provide a little bit of insurance just in case you are using him in a defensive capacity, whether you've got something like ring mail attached to him, or if you're taking advantage of one of the new boon cards we're going to be covering in just a few minutes that this article spoils. So long as he has the 1 ring attached to him, it could definitely save you a scenario loss by preventing him from leaving play.
Yeah, certainly. We'll be talking about the Balrog, I'm sure, the new version, and Frodo seems like a prime defender against that nasty enemy. Otherwise, I would assume, just like the Black Riders, having an exhausted One Ring will be quite dangerous. There were a bunch of effects in the Black Riders that got more potent if the One Ring was exhausted, so I'm sure this is going to be an ability that you're going to want to use sparingly.
Really, the only shame about this ability is that he has to exhaust after defending an attack, so unlike our spirit version that I mentioned, you can't use this to mitigate any kind of damage taken during the staging step of the quest phase. And since we can see on one of the enemies spoiled in this article that archery is going to be making a recurrence, this ability isn't going to allow Frodo to escape any of that kind of damage either.
Yeah, one thing the article doesn't mention, and I'll be curious to see, is whether or not we get to choose which version of the Saga Fellowship Sphere Frodos we'd like to use. Do you get to choose if you want to use this one? Do you get to choose if you wanted to use the first one? So that will certainly, I think, add some perhaps replayability or some additional strategic depth to these Saga expansion quests.
Well, certainly if that does end up being the case, I think that would be very cool. It would certainly add some replayability. If you can't, I would understand that too. At least judging by the card art, this certainly seems a more combat-seasoned Frodo Baggins, since he's standing there holding Sting. It would make sense if there's a little bit of character progression, but I certainly don't mind options. People have been wondering if we'll see any ring bearers other than Frodo, whether it's Sam or Boromir or anyone else, so by all means, the more options we have, the happier I would be. I happened to mention that in this article, FFG took the liberty of spoiling a brand new Fellowship Sphere card, and that's a unique attachment Fellowship of the Ring, which for a cost of 2 has the Fellowship trait and reads Attached to the Ring Bearer. Each hero gets +1 willpower and forced. After a character leaves play, discard Fellowship of the Ring. So, like I mentioned earlier, Frodo's intuition that we were introduced to in the Black Riders is an incredibly potent card. So long as you can spend those Fellowship resources, it can have an absolutely astronomical effect, and the same goes for the Fellowship of the Ring. So long as you can stomach that investment of 2 resources, every single hero, which in a multiplayer game, considering Frodo counts as a free 4th hero, can be an incredible 13 characters getting +1 willpower. That effect is just huge. Even though this attachment seems like it can leave play relatively easily, there's nothing stopping you from having 3 copies in your deck, there's nothing stopping every player from having 3 copies, and certainly if you want to save this until maybe the end of the scenario when you need to make that final enormous push to make it through, this could be an incredible means of facilitating that. If at any point you find yourself struggling to save up these Fellowship Sphere resources, maybe because you want to use this enormously powerful attachment and the enormously powerful event from the Black Riders, keep in mind that Good Meal from Red Horngate could allow you to play Frodo's Intuition for free, and then spend those resources on Fellowship of the Ring. So I'm very curious to see how fragile this attachment is. I would assume characters leaving play happens pretty frequently, but just like I said, I think if you play this intelligently, if you maybe save it for an opportune moment, it can just have an incredible beneficial effect for the players.
Yeah, I don't think I'm quite as impressed with it as you are, Mitch. Or for one, again, the Balrog we're about to talk about has 8 attack strength. Certainly the Nazgul from the Black Riders swing with quite a hefty punch, and so I think characters will be leaving play quite often. Certainly it's not going to combo very well with the new Elf cards we've seen from the upcoming cycle. With that said, it's just rather humdrum for me. It's, each hero gets +1 willpower. If you've got a tactics player as your buddy, they're not questing with their heroes anyway, so it's really not getting that much of an added benefit. Certainly in a 4-player game, there's bound to be a tactics player, and again, they're not committing to the quest, most likely. But I think what I dislike about it the most, I think it's thematic. I think it's cool that the Fellowship all sort of bands together and their willpower increases. I think it's a good card from a thematic perspective, but it's like the 1,000th card that we've received that raises willpower. Nothing all that exciting. There's easier ways to do it. There's perhaps more permanent ways to raise willpower that might actually end up impacting more characters, whether it's Sword That Was Broken or Faramir or whatever. So, again, the Fellowship resources are often really precious. You need them to travel to locations or to cancel certain effects or whatnot. To play 2 for an attachment that is so fragile and likely to leave play, I'll have to see what these scenarios have in store for us, but I'm not so sure I'll be including it in my deck anytime soon.
I definitely think my opinion of this card could change. I do like that it's a little bit more inclusive to multiple deck archetypes than Frodo's intuition was. So for that event, you really got the most use out of it if you're running a Hobbit deck. This is certainly more friendly to any kind of heroes. But just like you said, we have absolutely no idea if these Fellowship Sphere resources are going to be extraordinarily scarce, or if you're going to be finding yourself with a little bit of a surplus. Certainly, if you are looking to take advantage of Fellowship Sphere cards, keep in mind that nowhere in the Black Riders rules does it mention that you can't put any sort of resource acceleration effect on Frodo, so I assume there's nothing preventing players from running the Steward of Gondor attached to him, and since you can use Fellowship resources to pay for neutral cards, that might not be the best move, so I'm curious to see how players use Fellowship of the Ring. I'm curious to see how players use our new iteration of Frodo. And of course, it goes without saying, I'm dead curious to find out who our second and only other hero in this Saga expansion is going to be.
Yeah, there's been a lot of speculation on the various forums. Some people upset that there's only one hero, some assuming that since there's only one hero, it's got to be a big, epic hero. So I'm just as curious as you are to find out who that hero will be.
So, I'm sure your guess is just as good as ours. Be sure to leave a comment on this video and let us know, who do you expect our second hero is going to be? Is it going to be a third version of Boromir? Is it going to be another version of some other member of the Fellowship of the Ring? Or is it maybe going to be someone from the Council of Elrond? So, feel free to share with us your thoughts. The article specifies that we can expect our second Lord of the Rings Saga expansion in the second quarter of 2014, so whether FFG decides to spoil it in another article, or whether we have to wait until we actually crack open the Saga expansion, it's not going to be long until we find out. This article mentions specifically that we're going to be receiving the benefit of 8 new boons in order to combat and counteract the 7 new burdens that we're going to be going up against, 2 of which are spoiled by this article, and for anyone that's played the Hobbit Saga expansions, seem pretty familiar. So the first of which is a unique attachment, a boon, with a cost of 1, the Mithril Shirt. It's artifact, item, and armor, and reads, attached to the ring bearer, attached hero gets +1 defense and +1 hit point. So just like I mentioned before, akin to ringmail, this is going to give Frodo a little bit more defensive utility. So with a boon like this, the probability of your actually having to trigger his response to mitigate the damage of an attack, may be bolstered by an unanticipated shadow effect, goes down a little bit. So he's a little bit more resilient, and he's got a little bit hardier pool of hit points. So I'm not sure how often I would be using him in a defensive capacity with that 2 willpower value, but in the Black Riders, we were often presented with choices to make, such as, do we want to add Mr. Underhill to our campaign pool, or do we want to add Gildor Inglorian to our campaign pool? So I'll be curious as to how exactly we collect the Mithril Shirts. I'm not sure how thrilled I am to use it, but again, it's gonna be an option.
So just like Mithril Shirt is a repeat of a treasure from the Hobbit sagas, so is the next spoiled boon attachment, Glamdring, with a cost of 2. It's a little bit different in that it's not free like it was in those Hobbit sagas. It must attach to a warrior hero or to Gandalf, so that's a slight difference from the original version, and it is restricted. The attached hero gets +2 attack strength and response. After attached character destroys an orc enemy, draw 1 card. So again, not a whole lot to say here, as it is awfully familiar and similar to the previous version, but certainly it's nice to see Glamdring make an appearance in the Lord of the Rings sagas.
Yeah, really the only thing I have to add about this boon is it's the first time we can ever take advantage of that warrior trait. So, in the Black Riders, we saw a boon called Valiant Warrior, which gives an attached hero +1 attack and the warrior trait. So if you find yourself using heroes that don't start off with that trait, but you really want to bolster their attack strength, that's certainly a combo that could allow you to do it. But even though the article itself is fairly brief, it also links to a mini-site for the Road Darkens, which explains a little bit more in depth what we can expect from our 3 new scenarios. The mini-site goes on to mention that these 3 new adventures are going to be bringing us as close to Frodo Baggins and his fantastic struggles as we can be without finding snow on our jackets or finding ourselves standing face to face with a Balrog. They mention in The Ring Goes South, we must help Frodo and his companions find passage through the hills of Hollin and the snows that follow them into the Misty Mountains. Along the way, we'll be harassed by wargs and regiments of dark crows. We'll have to find the doors of Durin, and we'll have to survive a combat with the deadly Watcher in the Water, which sounds fairly familiar to me. Kind of a mix between the Red Horn Gate and the Watcher in the Water, but I'm curious to see what FFG does with it. Then, in Journey in the Dark, we'll have to find our way as quickly as possible through the mines of Moria, but it won't be easy. There are many roads to choose from, hordes of orcs lurking in the depths and the darkness, and there are far older and fouler things that we must also face, which sounds a hell of a lot like Flight from Moria. And finally, Breaking of the Fellowship relates a select sequence of events from the final chapters of the Fellowship of the Ring. When Frodo disappears, the rest of our fellowship must track him down. Our desperate efforts may lead them in different directions, and some may not return. I cannot imagine who FFG is alluding to, but I'm curious to see especially what they do with the last one, just because it sounds as if those 2 first scenarios are, in a lot of ways, rehashes of scenarios they've already drawn material from.
Yeah, I think in many ways this was probably the most difficult from a design perspective for Caleb and Matt, because we already have seen at least one version or perhaps 2 versions of some of these quests in the past. However, I thought the Hobbit version, the Hobbit quest where we fought the trolls, was a much improved version of Conflict at the Carrick. It was still different enough to feel fresh. So I definitely have high hopes that the first 2 quests won't simply feel like retreads of previous quests, and certainly Breaking of the Fellowship should be fun. I highly doubt that they would forbid us from playing Boromir from the rest of the game. That seems like it's too restrictive, but it is interesting to think perhaps a hero that you use becomes the quasi-Boromir, or the Boromir in spirit, and then you can no longer use that hero for the rest of the campaign, should you choose to play in campaign mode. So that could certainly be cool. I think that'll be the quest that most of us are looking most forward to, and I can't wait to play them.
While we're on the topic of campaign mode, the mini-site goes on to spoil one of our new burdens, which is Lust for the Ring. It's a treachery with the trait Corruption. It has Surge and the keyword Peril, and since the progression series is yet to cover Black Riders, Peril was a keyword introduced in that Saga expansion wherein, when a player reveals an encounter card with the Peril keyword, he or she must resolve the staging of that card on their own without conferring with other players. The other players cannot take any actions or trigger any responses during the resolution of that specific card's staging. And this treachery reads, when revealed, attached to a non-fellowship hero in play. It counts as a condition attachment with the text, forced. After the one ring exhausts, reduce attached hero's willpower to 0 and raise each player's threat by 1, which I think is very cool. It's very thematically fun for as nasty of an effect as it is, just because I can't help but imagine Boromir lusting for the ring. It looks like he's portrayed in the car art. His willpower drops to absolute nothing. There's all sorts of dark, evil, nasty stuff going on. I just think this is a very fun, very flavorful card.
Yeah, it's what I was talking about earlier on our discussion of Frodo, where exhausting the ring is really dangerous. So whether it's this version, where you exhaust to defend and exhaust the ring to sort of cancel that attack, or if we're able to use that previous version, exhausting to counter a encounter card effect, it starts to add some strategic depth. Well, do I really need to counter this effect, or can we all stomach raising our threat by 1? So yeah, I think these boons and burdens really are cool, and I'm looking forward to someday playing campaign mode.
Yeah, I'm definitely a little bit wary to take the plunge into campaign mode. In the Black Riders, we ended up seeing 5 different burden cards, so even though it was impossible to accumulate all of them, I still can't help but feel that over the course of an entire 6 Saga expansions, a total of 18 scenarios, like your encounter deck could be so bogged down with these surging burden cards that making any progress seems next to impossible, especially considering that players accrue additional threat every time they change heroes throughout their campaign. It just seems like by the time you make it to the final 3 scenarios, the odds are going to be so stacked against you that the chances of your success are just going to be astronomically small. But I suppose that would fit in with this tiny little pair of hobbits trying to make it all the way from the Shire to the very fires of Mount Doom. But as a means of wrapping up this article, why don't we take a look at 2 of the player cards that might just help balance out the odds for the players. The first of which is a unique spirit ally, a new version of Bilbo Baggins. For a cost of 2, he has 2 willpower, 0 attack, 0 defense, and 2 hit points. He has the Hobbit trait and response. After Bilbo Baggins enters play, search your deck for a pipe attachment and add it to your hand. Shuffle your deck. Of course, we have no way of knowing if there are going to be any new pipe attachments coming out in the Road Darkens, but our existing Hobbit pipe introduced in the Black Riders can be a pretty significant source of card draw. Spirit excels in reducing threat, and a Hobbit pipe is a reusable effect that allows players to draw cards time and time again. There's no limit to the number of these that you can have in play, only a limit of 1 per character. So Bilbo, for that investment of 2, you get good willpower, you get a good attachment. So long as you've got Galadrim's Greeting or Elrond's Counsel, you can see some pretty serious card advantage.
So yeah, definitely an interesting card. On face value, 2 costs for 2 willpower is nice. He's rather squishy with those 2 hit points, but of course, if you're going to be running a Hobbit deck, you probably will have Build a Pony to bump him up to 3. I definitely think his response is interesting in that I think this might be the first card, or it's certainly one of the few, that would allow you to search your entire deck for a card. Usually these sort of scrying effects or fetch effects only work against the top 5 or top 10 cards of your deck. So definitely interesting. I'm curious to see if we'll get more pipes. Hopefully we do. It could be fun. But if not, I think this ability, if you're wanting to use smoke rings or Hobbit pipe, Bilbo is a natural fit for that to help you fish those out of your deck. So this ally version, of course, means you can't use his hero version, but that might not be a drawback for some players.
I definitely agree. I won't say too much more because I'm sure we're going to go much more in depth about Hobbit Pipe, Bill the Pony, and a host of other Hobbit cards once we get around to reviewing the Black Riders. I'll just say that I think Bilbo's great for those 2 resources. We've seen other allies like West Road Traveler where the effect isn't always useful in today's quests, so he's got multiple hit points, he's relatively survivable compared to some other allies during staging, so I really like him. I think it's funny that he's in some ways such a polar opposite from his original lore iteration where you could do the burning brand trick and he was maybe a little bit of a defensive powerhouse. I remember hearing stories of people playing the Battle of Lake Town and making Bilbo their primary defender against Smaug, so it's a bit of a shame that you're not going to be able to play him in any of the Hobbit Saga expansions. You're not going to be able to play him in our upcoming Nightmare versions of our Hobbit Saga expansions, but I very much look forward to playing him as he currently is, and as we see more pipes, he's only going to get better.
So the final unique ally spoiled in the article is none other than Elrond. He is a lore ally with a cost of 3. He has a whopping 3 willpower, 2 attack strength, 3 defense strength, and 3 hit points. He is both Noldor and healer, and by the end of the round you have to discard Elrond from play. His response reads, after Elrond enters play, choose 1. Heal all damage from a hero, discard a condition attachment, or each player draws 1 card. So right off the bat, I think of the core set version of Gandalf, who has 3 things you can choose from. He gets only in play for a turn. So very interesting. Great stats, certainly. Nice price. I think if we're willing to pay for Gandalf, we'll probably be willing to pay for Elrond. I definitely like his abilities. Healing all damage from a hero is certainly less expensive than other lore events that do the same thing. I love the discard a condition attachment because we only have 1 means of doing so at this point in the game. But even each player drawing a card can be quite nice. So I think Elrond is a spectacular ally, and should I be building lore decks or perhaps even Noldor elf decks in the future, I can pretty much guarantee that this ally version will be a strong contender for a slot in my deck.
I definitely like this ally. We're starting to see cards released in the Ringmaker cycle where the theme for these Sylvan and Noldor characters is leaving play. So beyond Horn of Gondor, beyond Valiant Sacrifice, I'm sure we're going to see a host of other effects that derive some sort of benefit from Elrond leaving play at the end of the round. And apart from that, choices are always powerful. How many situations have we been in where we include something like a Miner of the Iron Hills in our deck specifically so that we can remove condition attachments? A lot of players like to build one deck to rule them all or one deck to beat them all, and Elrond is so much more flexible than something like a Miner, which in some scenarios, if you've got to get rid of Caught in a Web or something like that, it feels kind of mandatory. And when you look at his price, comparing that to similar cards that serve the same purpose, he's just incredible. So compared to something like Lore of Imladris, he enters play, you pick a character, both of them heal all damage from that character, but Elrond only costs 1 more, so maybe you're getting 3 willpower for 1 additional resource. He's a little bit limited, and you can only play allies during the planning phase, but that is just one hell of an ability. Campfire Tales is one resource to have every player draw a card, so the savings isn't quite as good there, but again, he's such a powerful ally, and he's just one more resource than that Miner of the Iron Hills, yet he brings such a greater number of stat points to the table, so he is very ephemeral. You can't rely on him sticking around for long, but it's a very flexible, very powerful character, and I guarantee we'll be playing him soon.
My final thought on Elrond is that in some decks, or at least against some scenarios, he might be giving Gandalf a run for his money when it comes to being the prime target for sneak attack.
Really, all I can think of to add is that since in the Road Darkens we finally see a use for the warrior trait, maybe we'll end up seeing something for healers as well. As an absolute final thought about Elrond, really the only shame about this character is by no means does he synergize with my beloved Sylvan refugees. So, before we finally bring this video to a close, that Minisite also completely spoils 2 additional encounter cards, and saving the best for last, let's cover the treachery first. It's Bitter Cold of the trait Weather, and when revealed, each player must choose, either discard each ally he controls, or raise his threat by 1 for each ally he controls. And Shadow. Attacking enemy makes an additional attack after this one. So, not really too much to say about this. Pretty nasty treachery. I think ideally this might be a first turn reveal, but that shadow effect is just horrific, so all in all, could be awful, could be not that big of a deal.
Right. My first thought, and maybe the only one I'll have here, is that it certainly could wreck Outland's decks, either early in the game by killing all the allies, or late in the game when you have so many out. So, in a way, I'm gleefully excited to see this card against perhaps an Outland's deck. Perhaps the more interesting encounter card that's fully spoiled is another version of the Balrog. His engagement cost is 50, 5 threat, 8 attack strength, 9 defense strength, and 25 hit points. He has the traits Balrog, Shadow, and Flame. He's indestructible. He cannot be optionally engaged. The Balrog and Shadow cards dealt to the Balrog are immune to player card effects. In the staging area, the Balrog is considered to be engaged with the first player, and only the first player can declare attackers against the Balrog, and he's worth a whopping 50 victory points. So it certainly seems like the Balrog of Shadow and Flame and the Khazad-dûm set has been eating his Wheaties. This guy is monstrous. Biggest enemy so far in the game. Interestingly, too, for me, is it's probably one of the more abstract art pieces in the game from what we can tell, so it's an interesting depiction of the Balrog. He's absolutely nasty. He's going to be killing things left and right. It's interesting that only the first player can attack him. It's interesting that you cannot cancel his shadow effects whatsoever. I'm just guessing he's going to be a monstrous enemy that will be quite tough to deal with.
He definitely seems like an absolute monster. That attack strength is astronomical. Even though a hero like Baragond with a Gondorian shield can stomach an attack that hard, not being able to cancel shadow effects could potentially be horrific, whether it's attack bolstering or God forbid he makes additional attacks. It just seems like this could be a terrifying adversary. I can't help but feel with that astronomical victory point value, killing him is going to somehow be optional. It just so happens that today FFG released a new version of our FAQ where one popular source of Dwarven attack strength was nerfed, so let us know what your plans are. How could you possibly hope to overcome some horrific enemy like this? It seems like it's going to be a complete pain in the ass, but we'll have to see if the quest is maybe somehow structured around giving players some sort of leverage to beat this opponent, or, like I pointed out, maybe dispatching him is optional. Maybe it's something of a built-in nightmare or challenge mode in and of itself, but I'm certainly excited to see this scenario. Players are always excited for a nightmarishly difficult encounter, or at least some players are, but we'll have to see how this all comes together. So, I suppose that brings our article to an end. We've covered our mini-site. Overall, any final thoughts, Matthew?
Yeah, I will say that the Black Riders is probably one of my favorite, if not my favorite expansion for the game. Caleb just did a bang-up job capturing the theme and introducing some really interesting mechanics. I'm pretty excited by this announcement article. My excitement might be tempered somewhat by the fact that we are retreading some story of previous quests, although again, I have full faith in Caleb and Matt for coming up with a way to make them feel fresh and interesting and very epic in scope, even if you're not playing campaign mode. So I'm not quite as excited about this one as I was the previous one, but I definitely think the game is in good hands, and I really can't wait for quarter 2 to get here so we can bust these quests out.
Definitely. I'm sure by the time the progression series makes it through the Black Riders, it won't be long at all until it's time for us to play the Road Darkens. So, I suppose that brings this video to a close, so as always, thank you guys for checking out this video. If you enjoyed what you saw, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel if you have not done so already. This is a pretty new community, so those subscriptions help more than ever before. If you're on Facebook, we're facebook.com/10th Nazgul Show. Maybe it's a little surprising, maybe not, but the 10th Nazgul was taken. If you'd like to share any thoughts about this article, about the mini-site, if you've thought of any good uses for our player cards or good strategies to overcome any of these nasty new encounter cards, be sure to let us know in the comments below. And with that said, we'll see you again soon.